So just as background, Sri Lanka is a democratic republic with a multi-party system. As you can see from the map, it's located on an island that's approximately 25 miles from the southeast tip of India. The population is estimated to be about 20 million. It's composed of a Sinhalese majority and minority Tamil and Muslim groups. Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist, while Tamils are mostly Hindu. There's a Christian minority of both the Sinhalese and Tamil groups as well. After independence from Great Britain in 1948, successive Sinhalese-dominated governments took steps to redress what they felt to be an imbalance in favor of Tamils derived from the British colonial period. Major issues considered language, what was going to be the official language of the country, land, who got access to land, how was land being distributed, and access to government employment and higher education. The Tamil minority felt increasingly marginalized and sought autonomy for the northeast of the country, which was seen by the Tamils as their traditional homeland. After decades of peaceful agitation failed to achieve any result, Tamil political parties in 1976 called for an independent Tamil state in the northeast. Tamil youth joined militant groups and began attacking security forces. The conflict escalated in 1983 into full-scale civil war. After fighting among different Tamil militant groups, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, often called the Tamil Tigers, emerged as the dominant separatist group. Decades of fighting between the government forces and the Tigers produced no conclusive result, with neither side being strong enough to defeat the other, with attempts at peace talks repeatedly failing. The war ended, as the film showed, finally in May of 2009, with the government's military victory over the Tigers. During the decades of the war, the Sri Lankan security forces committed thousands of human rights violations against unarmed Tamils who were suspected to be supporters or members of the Tigers, including arbitrary detention, torture, extrajudicial execution, sometimes called political killing, and enforced disappearances. In particular, enforced disappearances appear to be used for two purposes. It facilitated torture without accountability, and it concealed the killing of prisoners. It should also be noted that over the years, the Tigers themselves have been responsible for scores of grave human rights abuses, including the indiscriminate, deliberate killing of civilians, torture and execution of prisoners, and abductions for ransom, and the forcible recruitment and use of child soldiers. Amnesty International publicly condemned these crimes. Their civilians included both Tamil civilians as well as Sinhalese and Muslim, as well as politicians. A ceasefire went into effect in 2002, but began to unravel in late 2005, and by mid-2006, full-scale war had resumed. Over the next two-year period between 2006 and 2008, the Sri Lankan government recaptured the Tiger-held territory in East India. Then in 2008, the military turned to the north and undertook an intense offensive that eventually recaptured all the remaining Tiger-held territory by mid-May of 2009. As the film showed, Sri Lanka's killing fields. In the course of recapturing the remaining Tiger-held territory, the military committed gross human rights abuses and war crimes. They deliberately and indiscriminately shelled areas that they knew were heavily populated with civilians. They kept adequate amounts of food and medical supplies from entering the war zone, thus causing terrible suffering for the trapped civilians. The Tigers also committed war crimes and human rights abuses during the final months. They kept around 300,000 civilians trapped in the war zone and used them as human shields. They shot civilians who attempted to flee the war zone, and they continued to forcibly recruit and use child soldiers. So what's the current situation now for achieving accountability for war crimes and other abuses? And I'd also like to say a few words about what you can do to help. You should be aware that the Sri Lankan government established an ad hoc Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission in May of 2010 and said it would be the vehicle for accountability. We at Amnesty were very skeptical of the commission. The fact is, as documented in our report, 20 years of make-believe, Sri Lanka's commissions of inquiry. The Sri Lankan government has repeatedly set up temporary commissions of inquiry in response to international pressure on human rights. These commissions have not produced justice for victims, but have merely served to deflect pressure. The Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission was merely the latest in a long line of such bodies. We also found that this commission didn't have the requisite independence from the government and impartiality to be an effective mechanism for accountability. Amnesty, along with Human Rights Watch and the International Crisis Group, were invited to testify before this commission, but all three organizations declined to do so. Since we knew the commission was so flawed, it would not provide accountability, and we didn't want to lend it legitimacy by testifying in court. Unfortunately, as it proved in its workings, the commission was deficient, as it held hearings and took testimony from witnesses. We produced another report called When Will They Get Justice? Failures of Sri Lanka's Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission that details these failures. And the amnesty reports, by the way, are available on our website. If you go to amnesty.org and search under Sri Lanka. The Reconciliation Commission issued their final report to President Rajapaksa about a year ago. It was publicly released on December 16th of last year. The Commission's report proved that our concerns about their impartiality and independence were well-founded. They did make some valuable recommendations on several issues other than accountability for war crimes. But when it came to the war crimes issue, the Commission showed that for the most part, they simply accepted what the Sri Lankan military had told them during the hearings. And therefore, it didn't find any accountability for war crimes on the part of the military, aside from a couple of incidents. The Commission actually acknowledged their inability to determine the facts on some of the critical issues. For instance, who was responsible for shelling the hospitals repeatedly? The government had said the Tigers were responsible for shelling the hospitals, as opposed to the evidence we've seen, which is that the Sri Lankan military was. The Commission's report demonstrated that we really need an impartial international investigation into these crimes if we're going to get accountability. Film Sri Lanka's Killing Fields referred a couple of times to something called the UN panel. You should be aware of what that is. In June of 2010, shortly after the Sri Lankans had set up the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, established a 3-member advisory panel of experts to advise him on accountability issues in Sri Lanka. Actually, the Sri Lankans set up the commission because they knew Ban Ki-moon was about to set up this panel. And they were trying to do it to head it off, to say, we're doing our own thing, leave us alone, we have our commission. But Ban set up this panel anyway. The panel took a lot of testimony, or it got a lot of evidence which it considered, and issued its report last year, which was made public in April of last year. The UN panel found that there were credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, having been committed by both the government forces and the Tigers during the war. The panel, this is the UN panel, recommended that the Sri Lankan government set up effective investigations into these allegations, and that the UN also set up an international investigation to make sure that there were genuine investigations being done by the Sri Lankans. Ban Ki-moon, after that report came out, said that he didn't have the authority to establish an international investigation by himself. He would need either the consent of the Sri Lankan government, or he would need authorization by a UN body, such as the Security Council, the General Assembly, or the Human Rights Council. None of those bodies has yet provided any such authorization. In March of this year, the UN Human Rights Council did adopt a resolution on Sri Lanka, which called on Sri Lanka to formulate a comprehensive action plan to implement the Reconciliation Commission's recommendations and also provide accountability for the violations of international law during the war. The Council's resolution didn't establish an international war crimes investigation, but it is a good first step. We hope the Human Rights Council will, at its next session next March, authorize the establishment of an international investigation. We Human Rights Council's resolution also said they wanted the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights to provide technical assistance to the Sri Lankan government. And they wanted the High Commissioner to report back to the Council in a year about what efforts and what assistance she was able to give the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government hated that resolution and initially said they would have nothing to do with the High Commissioner coming to Sri Lanka. They subsequently have reversed themselves and have said she's welcome to come and I'll talk to her. I think they're seeing that next March it's going to be on the Human Rights Council's agenda again, which they hate. And if nothing has happened in a year, that will allow the U.S. and other countries the ability to say, well, you're not producing any kind of progress, so we need an international investigation. So one of the things the Sri Lankans did after the Human Rights Council, which is the UN body, passed the resolution, was to begin to invite MAH00014, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to the country. They've also, the Sri Lankan government, issued a national plan of action which commits to limited implementation of some of the recommendations from their own Reconciliation Commission. Their plan relies on government agencies associated with human rights violations to investigate. Like the armed forces are expected to investigate the human rights abuses and war crimes committed by the armed forces during the war. It doesn't provide for any new or independent body to do this kind of investigation. So we think that the plan by the Sri Lankan government doesn't really demonstrate any political will to account for the war crimes. It simply is another method of providing more process without any substance. Now, just a few words as to what people here in the U.S. can do to help in protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. For one thing, you can join Amnesty International if you're not already a member. And the material at the end of the table, if you're interested, pick that up. It has how to become a member of Amnesty. And for students, they even waive dues down to a smaller amount, not the usual $35 or $25. It's routine. Another 10, please, if you're not already a member of the group, either the bigger NIU group or the law school NIU group, please consider joining. Please also sign the petitions on the table. Beyond the petition for Pradeep Navigoda, there is another case that an AI local group is campaigning on. Raghuvar Manoharan, a young Tamil student, part of a group called Trinco 5. 5 students in Trincomalee, which is a city on the northeast coast of Sri Lanka. On January 2nd of 2006, they were killed by the security forces. The security forces initially said they were tigers and they were plotting something and they got injured, blown up by a hand grenade. The facts were that they were not tigers. They were shot in the head by the security forces as a part of a deliberately planned effort to teach the Tamils a lesson a few days after some Sinhalese businessmen in Trincomalee had been killed by tigers. This was in 2006. This was almost 7 years ago. So Amnesty is calling on the Sri Lankan government to prosecute the murderers. We haven't seen any progress with it. So we have a petition on that case. We have a petition to Secretary Hillary Clinton while she's still secretary, asking the U.S. to support establishing an international war crimes investigation in Sri Lanka. The U.S. government position right now is that they fully expect the Sri Lankans to do what needs to be done for accountability. The U.S. has said that if the Sri Lankans don't take action in a timely fashion, there may be international pressure to have an international investigation. But the U.S. has not given any time frame and has not said when they might start supporting setting up an international investigation. So we need to keep the pressure on the U.S. government to push them along and say, it's been over 3 years, it's soon going to be 4 years since the war ended. It's time to have an international investigation. So that petition is on the table as well. Another major issue we also are campaigning on in Sri Lanka is Sri Lanka, during the years of the war, passed security legislation, something called the Prevention of Terrorism Act. They have emergency regulations. These security laws overturn the general criminal code so that as opposed to having to have a warrant when you arrested someone and give them evidence of, okay, what's the charge, and have to produce them before a magistrate within a certain time period, and having the ability to say, if you obtain evidence from them under torture, it's the burden of proof is on the security forces that it was torture, that it was not torture. The security laws reverse all that. They can arrest you without charge. They can hold you up to 18 months. In fact, they usually ignore that, just keep holding you longer. If you confess while you're in custody, anyone above a certain level of the police is entitled to take your confession. And if you allege in court that your confession was coerced and obtained through torture, the burden of proof is on you to prove you were tortured, and not on the government to say, no, you were not tortured. So what's been happening during the war and since the end of the war, and continues to happen, the Sri Lankan government arrests people without charge or trial. They lock them up. They don't tell the family members where they are. They hold them indefinitely. People do occasionally get out. They get out by bribing the guards, by bribing the system. And then we find out about them. Sometimes they are released when they get out. Most people who are detained are tortured. The way they prosecute people is through confession, which they obtain through torture. So part of what we are doing, part of one of our campaigns is on this set of laws and on these people who are being tortured, and some of them are killed in custody. So we think Sri Lanka needs to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We need to get rid of the emergency regulations that allow this. We need to prosecute people who are guilty of torturing people, provide people who have been tortured with compensation. And there are hundreds of people currently still being detained without charge or trial in Sri Lanka. They continue to lock people up and do this, even though the war has been over for a long time. So the petition on the table is on that issue, and that's directed to the Sri Lankan government. Finally, we have a South Asia Regional Action Network. People might be interested in getting ongoing actions, amnesties, campaigns in Sri Lanka or in other parts of South Asia, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. You can sign up on our sign-up sheet there, and you'll get monthly emails. With that, I think that's the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you for coming, and I'm opening up for questions. More questions?
I know a lot of international humanitarian law, armed conflict is more like customary international law and Geneva Conventions and Hague and all that. Is there any treaty law that would subject them to some sort of internal investigation? Would they sign anything that would allow some sort of other UN body or committee to come in and make some sort of investigation?
Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions is about conflicts of a non-international character that apply to that conflict. They and all the other signatories to the Geneva Conventions are supposed to uphold it. So if someone is guilty of war crimes under that, all of us, all countries, and the U.S. and others have signed the Geneva Conventions. We shouldn't be holding people we think may be guilty of war crimes accountable. We should find them, lock them up, and try them. So that applies to the Sri Lankan government, applies to the U.S., applies to all the other countries who signed the conventions. One problem we have in U.S. law is, I looked into this a little bit, not an expert on international humanitarian. There is the War Crimes Act, which is part of U.S., it's in U.S. code. But that applies to war crimes committed abroad by U.S. nationals or people with residency rights here. And there are a couple of Sri Lankans, actually. The defense secretary has a green card, and so he has residency rights here. In fact, before he went back to Sri Lanka toward the end of the final stages of the war, after his brother was elected president, he was working in Los Angeles for, was it UCLA? It was one of the universities in Los Angeles as their IT guy. So he was living and working here. This is Gandhara, the box office. president. Gotabaya had been in the Sri Lankan military before that, before he came to the U.S. So his brother, Mahinda, brings him back and becomes defense secretary. So he was in overall charge of the war effort. The guy who had been army commander at the end of the war, Sarah Fonseca, who later became the opposition presidential candidate, I think has U.S. citizenship as well. So if he comes here, you could try. The Sri Lankan government went after him because he decided to run against Mahinda in 2010. So as he decided to run, they figured out that actually he was guilty of corruption, he was guilty of slander, and a whole bunch of violations of military law. So they put him through a couple of different court martials and at least one civil case. So he's been in jail a lot. He's out now. They've been going after him. Amnesty has been saying, this is somebody who himself is army commander who might want to go after if he ever leaves the country. Part of the problem is you have to have jurisdiction. If you're not talking about getting the Sri Lankan government to and get jurisdiction over them, they have to be leaving the country to do that. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa has gone to the UK a couple times, and I know there's some effort by some people to try to get him prosecuted while he was there. Some other groups in the U.S. have tried to do civil lawsuits based on the Torture Victim Protection Act or the Alien Claim Act here against Mahinda, but those have been thrown out on the basis of, as a sitting head of government, head of state, he has sovereign immunity. So the U.S. government has presented amicus brief to the court saying, we don't think you should proceed with the civil case. He's a sitting president, head of the government and the state. And so those cases have been tossed out as, under diplomatic comity, you don't go after each other while you're in power. So I fully think this is not something that we are going to see dramatic progress on in the short term. It would be great if the UN Human Rights Council does something next March. The fact that we got it on the agenda, that resolution passed last March, was a big victory. Because the Sri Lankans lobbied as hard as they could to keep it off the international agenda. They don't want the Human Rights Council thinking about it because it allows people like Amnesty, and in fact the US government was strategic pushing that resolution. They drafted the resolution, promoted the resolution, and they got India on board, which was also key, because India is a major player. You don't want everything coming from the West. You want the South as well, saying this isn't just the West against the South or the Third World. This is people who care about human rights, which is not just a Western concept, against human rights violators from the Sri Lankan government. So I'm hopeful we'll see something in March that may lead to more progress. Did you have your hand up there? No. Yes.
I guess ever since the war, how are people in Sri Lanka faring now? I mean, do they live in fear of political dissension of any kind? I mean, it's a democratic republic, but that only says so much, I guess.
The government has been triumphalist. They beat the Tigers. They ended the war. And they have a lot of support among the Sinhalese majority because of that. I mean, the Tigers were pretty awful, and they pioneered, for instance, the use of the suicide vest. They weren't the only ones who did suicide bombers, but if you look at the statistics for suicide bombers over, say, the last 30 or 40 years, people think suicide bombing is, Al-Qaeda, Islamic fundamentalist phenomenon. In fact, if you look at the statistics on suicide bombers, the Tigers had a lot of them. They weren't religious, they were separatist, and they were targeting Sri Lankans, they weren't targeting foreign. So part of what you need to understand is the Tigers could get suicide bombers any part of the island they chose to. So the capital, even though most of the war zone was in the northeast, and the capital, Colombo, is in the southwest, the Tigers could put suicide bombers in the capital when they wanted to. They killed President Pramadasa at a May Day rally, President of Sri Lanka. They killed Rajiv Gandhi in Tamil Nadu in India, another suicide bomber. Colombo has its own World Trade Center and they drove a truck into it and blew it up, or it caused massive damage to it. It caused massive damage to the central bank in Colombo. So people who lived in Colombo in the south would say nowhere was safe. And I send my kids to school, I don't know if they're coming back, because the bus could be targeted, or they could be caught up in a blast just on the street. So the fact that people have that measure of safety now, don't worry about that kind of bombing going on, is part of what makes the current government so popular. That said, they have cracked down on dissent in a way that more so than they had during the war. If you're an outspoken journalist, like Prageet, you can be disappeared, you can be harassed. Journalists have been leaving the country because of death threats. Human rights defenders are leaving the country because they're being targeted. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, they started an impeachment motion in Parliament against the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because the reports are that when the Supreme Court was ruling against the government on a couple of bills they wanted to have passed, the Supreme Court said were not constitutional, not consistent with the Sri Lankan Constitution. So what does the Sri Lankan executive do? They bring an impeachment motion in the Parliament to impeach the Chief Justice. So the judiciary has been under attack for some time in Sri Lanka. It's getting, human rights activists in Sri Lanka tell us people are more afraid as time has gone on, because the government is getting away with it, and they continue to get away with it. And as long as they can keep getting away with it, they're going to keep going. They're going to keep centralizing power. So we're on the outside. There's only so much we can do here. But part of what I'm trying to do is we'll do what we can here. So we'll draw attention to it, and we'll publicly talk about it, put pressure on the U.S. and other governments to speak up. The U.S. government has been helpful on Sri Lanka in the human rights situation. For instance, they did say, right after the impeachment motion was tabled, that the U.S. was concerned about anything that would threaten the independence of the judiciary. So publicly signaling to the Sri Lankans that the U.S. is not happy with what's going on. So it's not better, unfortunately. I mean, it's better in the sense we don't have the mass killings and the mass bombings.
Right.
We don't have those things going on. But picking people off here and there, that is still going on. It's getting worse.
So, but in the north, the minority areas still.
Yes,
still.
and then, yes, as Scott has reminded, in the former war, then I'll get to
I have a question.
You're just, okay, that's fine. The Northeast, where the final months of the war occurred, it's still very heavily militarized. The government, if you saw the film, you saw the camps that the displaced civilians were put in. The Sri Lankan government made a big deal of closing that camp and moving the final families out right before the Human Rights Council met in November, this past November. In fact, November 1st, they were looking at Sri Lanka's human rights record, because they wanted to say, look, we've had progress. So part of what they needed to do for the families who were there, which were about 280,000 people, was to do a lot of demining, because there were landmines strewn everywhere in the Northeast. So you couldn't send people back to the villages and let them get blown up. You had to go through and demine, and that is very time-consuming, labor-intensive, extremely dangerous. They have been doing a lot of demining. They've had, the military is doing it, they've had help with several NGOs to help them as well. And so they've had people going back to their villages. But it's a little more complicated than that, because some people, if they can get back to the village, they can't necessarily go farming again, because what they were doing was they were prioritizing the residential area to demine that first, and then move on and demine another residential area. But they weren't demining paddy fields. Well, if you're a farmer, it's great to go back to your village and live in your hut, but you can't go out and work in a paddy field because it'll get blown up. And what do you do for a job, and how do you make any money and support your family? So there are a lot of families in the Northeast who are without any kind of means of livelihood. People were fisher people on the coast. When they had to flee all those times, they